I am here to welcome you on behalf of the Chancellor, who's unfortunately unable to be here, and also on behalf of Pi Gamma Mu, which is the National Social Science Honorary, which is a co-sponsor of this meeting. At this time, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the introducer of the speaker, a very senior professor of history who is a specialist in American history and who is prolific as a most interesting writer of American history. In fact, I still have his book on California history and have enjoyed reading it from time to time. At this time, without further ado, I will introduce Professor John A. Coey, History Department.
Thank you very much, Mr. Parrish. I asked for the privilege of being the straight man tonight to my good friend Walter Johnson. You may know him through some of his writings. He has written on William Allen White and his America. He has written on he has edited a documentary history of the United States along with Avery Craven and another historian named Dunn. He has written a book on the Fulbright program and was particularly qualified to do so because, as a reviewer of this book stated, he was one of the program's guiding spirits. He has made something of a specialty, however, of editing rather than writing. He has edited some, at least, of the papers of William Allen White. He has edited papers of Joseph C. Grew. He has edited papers of Edward Stettinius. And now he has moved on to what I think should be the easiest editing job of all, editing the papers of a man whose writings, who was his own editor, and whose writings certainly must need a minimum of editing. I refer, of course, to Adlai Stevenson. Walter Johnson, for a number of years, quite a good many years, was professor of American history at the University of Chicago. He's transferred his presence and his operations to Honolulu, and is now professor of history at the University of Honolulu. I have lived most of the time about halfway between his two chosen residences, Chicago and Honolulu. I've met him a number of times. I remember him vividly at one meeting of the very conservative executive committee of the American Historical Association. Walter came in like a breath of fresh air, urging that group to shift its attention from building up a surplus and enlarging its own endowment to a program of greater activism in which those monies thus collected could be put to some actual use for the benefit of American history and other kinds of history. I met him once at a meeting of what used to be called the Mississippi Valley Historical Association, which was renamed the Organization of American Historians. At that meeting, he prevailed upon tonight's subject to come and grace one of the smokers at this meeting, and we all had a chance to shake the hand and exchange a word or two with Adlai Stevenson. I met him another time at Montgomery, Alabama, when the march from Selma to Montgomery was about to start. It occurred to one historian in the United States that there ought to be a delegation of American historians participating in this march, visible in it. Walter, who had that idea, got on the telephone, called a number of historians here and there. I bring this up because it's one thing about which UCLA can brag. By stretching our definition a bit and including a historian like Jerry King, whose specialty is 20th century France. UCLA was able to send a larger delegation to this particular march than any other institution in the country. Of course, we're a southern institution. It's easier to get to Montgomery from UCLA than from some parts in some of the institutions in the northern part of the United States. But that episode we really owed almost in its entirety to Walter Johnson. Perhaps I should assure you that you are safe tonight. Los Angeles' finest is encamped in mass just a short distance over the horizon here. And you may now sit back without any fear at all and listen to Walter Johnson. Glad you're here, Walter.
Thank you, Professor Coy. The immense power of words in the affairs of men in recent years, from the last 30 years or so, certainly been demonstrated to all of us, say, by the evil influence of Hitler's oratory, or by the spell, shall we say, of Winston Churchill's noble phrases. Now, the political air, as we know, is full of empty, dishonest, deceptive words, but men everywhere in recent years heard the ring of honesty, intelligence, and goodwill, in the words of Adlai Stevenson. And they heard him remind his fellow countrymen many times before his death of their great heritage and what they should do about implementing that heritage. In 1954, for instance, Stevenson said, "America's greatest contribution to human society has come not from her wealth or weapons or ambitions, but from her ideas, from the moral sentiments of human liberty and human welfare embodied in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. We must cling to these truths, for these are everlasting and universal aspirations." Throughout its history, he added, America has given hope, comfort, inspiration to freedom's cause in all lands. The reservoir of goodwill and respect for America was not built up by American arms or American intrigue. It was built upon the deep dedication to the cause of human liberty and human welfare. Now, during the decade of the 1950s particularly, Governor Stevenson sounded the tocsin in this country against drift and against complacency. Among other things, during those years, he advocated a détente, the Soviet Union, and an end particularly to emotional, mindless anti-communism. And although he was warned in 1956 by some of his advisors that he'd lose votes, he called in that campaign for a suspension of nuclear testing. He was denounced, shall we say, rather viciously by the then Vice President of the United States. 2 years later, of course, Ike came along and did suspend nuclear testing, but not in 1956. Also in 1956, Stevenson advocated the end of the inefficient, undemocratic, and archaic selective service system. So for 13 years, we're still struggling with the inefficient, archaic system. After his death, after Stevenson's death, Sir Michael Foot, then British ambassador to the United Nations, said that Stevenson was constantly trying to set standards and communicate ideas to raise the level of public life, and he did so. Stevenson himself, when he wrote an introduction to a volume of his 1952 campaign speeches, approached the whole problem that Michael Foot touched on with these words: "For years I've listened to the nauseous nonsense, the pie-in-the-sky appeals to cupidity and to greed, the cynical trifling with passion and prejudice and fear, the slander, the fraudulent promises, and the all things to all men demagoguery that are too much a part of our political campaigns. Sometimes in the deafening clamor of political salesmanship, I've thought that the people might be better served if our political parties purchased a half hour of radio and TV silence during which audiences would be asked to think quietly for themselves. Then he adds, politicians all applaud and support public education as democracy's great monument, its great cornerstone. But does the politician, the agent, spokesman of democracy, have no responsibility for public education? Government by the consent of the governed is the most difficult system of all because it depends for its success and viability on the good judgments and wise decisions of so many of us. But judgment and decision depend on information and understanding. In matters of public policy, candidates then have the greatest responsibility of all to inform truthfully so that the people will understand and will have the tools of good judgment and wise decision. Then he concludes this introduction by saying, I have no regrets about losing the election, except for the disappointment of so many dedicated supporters who share my hope of revitalizing a basic assumption of democracy, honest political leadership that despises the easy road to popularity and insists on focusing attention on reality and on truth, however distasteful. Unless the great political parties and their spokesmen assume responsibility for educating and guiding the people with constant candor, how can we be sure that majority rule will meet the test of these searching times? Now, as everybody who listened to him or knew him well knows, Stevenson was a master of distinguished writing style. You're quite right, the editing is easy in this case, but I do have to put footnotes explaining certain references, but that's about all. The style was witty, pungent, humorous, and above all, clear. And when occasion demanded, it could be effectively sharp. And he was free of the pomposities of prose that make the pronouncements of some leaders sound like the suckings of a leaky bilge pump. Stevenson was often given to deprecation of himself and occasional whimsy. And in his famous message to the Illinois legislature as governor, when he vetoed a bill that would have prevented cats from roaming at will, he can be seen at his most refreshing, humane best. The veto message in part reads as follows. I cannot agree that it should be the declared public policy of the state of Illinois that a cat visiting a neighbor's yard or crossing the highway is a public nuisance. It is in the nature of cats to do a certain amount of unescorted roaming. We are all interested, of course, in protecting certain varieties of birds. That cats destroy some birds, I well know. But I believe this legislation would further but little the worthy cause to which its proponents give such unselfish effort. The problem of cat versus bird is as old as time. If we attempt to resolve it by legislation, who knows? But what we may be called upon to take sides as well in the age-old problem of dog versus cat, bird versus bird, even bird versus worm. In my opinion, the state of Illinois and its local governing bodies already have enough to do without trying to control feline delinquency. Now, at the same time, this man was capable of Cromwellian sternness, whatever his outward courtly manners might appear. He was vigilant, for instance, against freedom-constricting pressures. In vetoing a bill that, among other things, would have established an anti-subversive squad to police the state of Illinois, as well as to police its state university, he wrote, this is long before it was popular to attack Joe McCarthy and that type of thing, he said, we must fight traitors with laws. We already have the laws. We must fight falsehood and evil ideas with truth and better ideas. We have them in plenty, but we must not confuse the two. Laws infringing our rights and intimidating unoffending persons without enlarging our security will neither catch subversives nor win converts to our better ideas. And in the long run, evil ideas can be counteracted and conquered, not by law, but only by better ideas. I know that to veto this bill in this period of grave anxiety will be unpopular with many. But I must, in good conscience, protest against any unnecessary suppression of our ancient rights as free men. Moreover, we will win the contest of ideas that afflicts the world not by suppressing these rights, but by their triumph. And at the same time, in this Cromwellian sternness that he had, he was quick to criticize reckless political statements, quick to challenge demagoguery. In December 1951, in a speech in Chicago before a group that didn't receive the speech happily, since it was the American Legion, he said, McCarthyism has become the trademark, and I mean Joe McCarthy, not confuse Gene. McCarthyism has become the trademark of a new breed of political demagogue who frightens the people with epithets, carelessly impugns the loyalty of patriotic men, and shouts dire forebodings of a treacherous doom for America and all of her cherished institutions. It is sad that America, at the height of her power, influence, and well-being, should be ringing with slander, epithet, ill temper, and the counsels of political desperation when all the world looks to us for dignity, sanity, and confident leadership. And he adds, there are some words uttered by the first Republican which reckless politicians could well ponder. Abraham Lincoln said, in times like the present, men should utter nothing for which they would not willingly be responsible through time and eternity. Not only in times like the present, but at all times. We should do nothing for which we do not wish to be held accountable in the future. The responsibility for our moral standards rests heavily upon the men and women in public life, because public confidence in the integrity of the government is indispensable to faith in democracy. And then 3 years later, at the height of Senator Joe McCarthy's investigations in Washington, Stevenson said, it is wicked and it is subversive for public officials to try deliberately to replace reason with passion, to substitute hatred for honest differences, to fulfill campaign promises by practicing deception, and to hide discord among Republicans by sowing the dragon's teeth of dissension among Americans. The loyalty and patriotism of a whole political party, one half the nation, has been indicted. 20 years of bipartisan effort, highly intelligent effort, has been called 20 years of treason. When one party says the other is the party of traitors who have deliberately conspired to betray America and to fill our government service with communists and spies, to send our men to unnecessary death in Korea, they violate not only the limits of partisanship, they offend not only the credulity of the people, but they stain the vision of America and of democracy for us and for the world we seek to lead. Now, after Adlai Stevenson was drafted against his wishes to be the Democratic candidate in 1952, he devoted the next 8 years of his life to preparing himself to serve in the presidency of the United States. And I emphasize the word serve in the presidency. You see, more expedient men concentrated on winning the presidency. He concentrated on what he would do once in office. The most recent biographer of President Johnson quotes President Johnson as saying he worked 40 years to get into the White House. Then the biographer adds, yeah, and he spent 15 minutes thinking of what he'd do when he got in there. That may be a little harsh, but my point is that Stevenson perhaps wasn't expedient enough at times. He concentrated not on winning the presidency, but preparing himself to serve in that office once elected. As an illustration of this, how he prepared himself from 52 on, and I could go earlier, of course, but then he was preparing himself for public service, not necessarily for the White House. As an illustration of how he prepared himself to serve in this office, in 1953, for instance, he took a journey of education to Asia and the Middle East, areas of the world he was not familiar with. Country after country, as they get off the plane, the reporters would be there and they'd want to know why he was there. He'd say, I came to learn. They couldn't believe it. They thought he came to make speeches or to tell them what was wrong with their country. He said, no, I came to learn. There is no press conference, gentlemen. I will hold one when I leave the country, but I wish to learn. Now, when he completed this trip, he remarked that it had been a fascinating trip, fatiguing and fattening. It's true, he had to go to official meetings. Those of us with him kept out of the official meetings, so we all lost weight and he added 20 pounds. The meaning of the trip for him was, at first hand, he saw the revolution of rising expectations, where people across the world were demanding a better chance at life. He witnessed Asia and the Middle East in the throes of revolutionary change, and he saw the death of European imperialism in many parts of Asia. And also he came to understand, as a result of this experience, stretching through many, many countries, the demand by people in Asia that they be treated as equals by white Westerners. Of course, as he was learning this, solving it for the future, there are always moments in the trip of relaxation for him and humor. One day, for instance, in the steamy climate of Cambodia, he was walking on the causeway leading to the great temples of Angkor Wat. And as he was going across the causeway, about 100 degrees it was all, an American woman tourist, a pure, one of Helen Hokinson, New Yorker type, cartoon type, had a camera around her neck. She came running up to him and she said, Adlai! She said, Adlai! She said, I have one picture left in my camera. I was going to take a water buffalo, but I prefer you. By the way, on that trip, while interviewing people, constantly learning, he never missed a ruin, nor did he ever miss a market. He loved markets, he loved ruins, so we went from Angkor Wat right through the world looking at ruins, as well as in trying to interview people about their activities and the problems of their country. And it was fascinating to observe how Asian leaders, with the exception of one, Chiang Kai-shek, who didn't quite approve of Adlai, Asian leaders were tremendously impressed with this rational mind. They'd never heard of him until he'd been nominated, you see, a few months before. His rational mind, his style, his wit. And one day it was illustrated, we'd seen it before, in Kashmir, where a member of the cabinet of the Kashmiri government started to explain what was wrong with American foreign policy. And this was something that you didn't have to ask a question about. It just turned on like a faucet, running completely. And among other things, this cabinet member said, the trouble with Americans are they're too impatient, that you expect easy and simplistic solutions to everything. And it's understandable from your history. You got a nearly empty continent, you had to fill it up with people and march across and develop it. Where these societies out here are complex, and he began to talk about the complexities. And finally Stevenson interjected and said, well, look, Your Excellency, I said all that in my campaign speeches last fall. Cabinet member said, oh, I know, Governor, I'm just quoting them back to you. Now, this was not so easy for him to quote back in 1953 because there was only one airplane a day that went from Delhi to Kashmir up in the high Himalayas. It was a little DC-3. And much of the time they couldn't get through the pass because it was fogged in. But they took the daily New York Times in Kashmir, mind you, which is a remote sort of paradise, although it's got its troubles, as you know, in terms of Pakistan versus India. Very remote part of the world. They had read these speeches. There wasn't any question of it. Now, it wasn't only his talking sense, his own phrase about his campaign, that impressed so many of these leaders and others that we saw in Asia. It's his humility that was impressive as well. For instance, after he'd been in a crash landing in a helicopter in the Malayan jungle, with the British taking him out all day, going into clearings to show the gorilla problem in the Malayan jungle, a reporter asked for his reactions to this crash landing. Stevenson replied, without any apparent thought that I could see about having planned a statement, he said, I'm glad nobody reminded me it was an American helicopter with an American engine. Well, the next day, the Straits Times of Singapore wrote a feature story in the front page. The last but one defeated presidential candidate to visit Malaya, Mr. Thomas E. Dewey, created a bad impression, so pronounced that the secret of Harry Truman's success was revealed in a blinding flash. I must say what irritated many of the Asian leaders about Dewey was that he brought two plainclothesmen from New York State with him, and they were intrigued, these reporters, and they said, "What are you doing? You're an historian. Dewey brought plainclothesmen." And I said, "Well, isn't that sort of the difference between the two guys?" Oh, they went off and wrote this up, regularly. Well, go on with the editorial. His successor, Mr. Adlai Stevenson, has wiped out the belief that defeat at the hands of the great American public corrodes the soul. A more charming man would be hard to find. Mr. Stevenson has busted rackets too, but he must have been very nice about it. Mr. Dewey talked to Malayan pressmen as though he saw in every one of them a potential Lucky Luciano or a Frank Costello. Mr. Dewey never could have said after a forced landing, "I'm glad nobody reminded me that it was an American helicopter with an American engine." He probably would have snapped, "Malaya needs American know-how in order to service the thing properly." Then weeks later, in this problem or attempt to learn through the Middle East, first the Arab world and then Israel, which was extremely tense in 1953, he bumped into a friend, good writer, David L. Cohn, who's written some superb books in American history and was the greatest ghostwriter I've ever known. Cohn wrote in the Washington Post, "Drifting around the Helston shores of the Mediterranean, where men sit in coffee houses and women are dancing girls, an admirable society we might well imitate at home, I ran into Adlai Stevenson with but one digestive tract to give for his country. He's given it at dozens of diplomatic dinners." Then Cohn says, "A handicap of the Middle East is that its people have always lacked the refining influence of the daughters of the American Revolution. Hence, for 3,000 years, they've been ready to fight at the drop of a dogma, making this a tough area to handle, from Herod, 3 BC, to John Foster Dulles, 1953 AD. Here, where vanished civilizations lie layer upon layer, like the wedges of a prize-winning county fair cake, Stevenson lunched one day on the Lake of Tiberias. Antiquity watching from the Galilean hills. Perhaps he profited more from this moment than from all of his briefings. For here a local man once wrote that where there is no vision, the people perish. Good thing to know, even at the cost of one's digestion." Well, Stevenson had more than charm and wit. He had a zest for life, an unspoilt freshness, a directness. He often said, for instance, "Fame is great so long as you don't inhale it." And there was no mistaking his Americanism, his energy. Those of us associated with him used to call it chronic stamina, the curiosity, the good spirits, and the frank goodwill. As his friend, the British writer Barbara Ward, has observed, all this gave a special quality to his learning, to his manner. Basically, he had the 18th century Enlightenment's belief in reason, possibility of progress, fundamental optimism, and intellectual curiosity. Now, I think among the reasons that he was such a reassuring figure overseas was that he advocated that American power be used generously, reasonably, and with a scrupulous concern for peace. But he could be stern, as we know, as was demonstrated in the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis at the United Nations. Nevertheless, he gave reassurance. American power would be used wisely, with due respect for the human community. For this position, of course, he was attacked by those Americans who frightened the rest of the human race, the super patriots, the Cold War warriors, the believers in unfettered, unilateral American power. And Stevenson found this America of national boasting, of saber-rattling, chest-thumping, to be utterly nauseating. As he stood for the America dedicated to the proposition, liberty and equality of opportunity. And to him, he died in 1965, as you recall, to him it could be the last best hope for a decent society. But now I come up to a problem, you see, as his editor. In view of his emphasis on reason, on talking sense, on insisting that American power be used wisely, and with due respect for the human community, how can Richard Walton, who's a freelance writer, but during the UN days of Stevenson was a broadcaster for the Voice of America, Richard Walton write an extremely interesting book called The Remnants of Power, The Tragic Last Years of Adlai Stevenson. It came out last fall. In that book, Walton says that to many of the intellectuals and the young and the idealistic, for whom he once had such enormous and unique appeal, he died for them not in esteem, but in disgrace. Walton also states that in the last year of his life, Governor Stevenson was not talking sense. He was not telling the truth about our involvement in Vietnam and the Dominican Republic. This, says Walton, was the man of rectitude, who had always believed in doing his duty, no matter how painful. Yet this man could not bring himself to do it now. He who instructed the American people for a decade and a half was unable to distinguish between his duty to a man who was president and his duty to the nation and its ideals. He could no longer speak the truth, says Walton. He could only play the game. He was pained, perhaps even tormented, but he could not bring himself to put his loyalty to the nation he had served so well above his loyalty to Lyndon B. Johnson as a member of the team. Well, that Adlai Stevenson was deeply frustrated and tormented in the last year of his life is indisputable. That he wanted to influence policy from the inside is also indisputable, although one of his great frustrations was his slight influence with both Presidents Kennedy and President Johnson. Arthur Schlesinger, in his book on the 1,000 Days of the Kennedy administration, has a phrase in there that's fascinating for its understatement. He says that there was always a twinge of exasperation between Kennedy and Stevenson. Well, twinge is hardly the word for that exasperation. And you know, it's very fascinating. One of the things that exasperated Jack Kennedy about Adlai Stevenson was that Adlai had great charm for women. And this always puzzled Jack Kennedy. And there's a story told of one day the president's out in his boat there at Hyannisport. He's got two lovely girls aboard. And when he comes into dock, Mrs. Kennedy, Jacqueline, who adored Stevenson, was there with Stevenson on the dock. And as the president brought the boat in, he pointed to the two girls and he said, "See, Adlai, women like me too." You know, there are other reasons for their exasperation, I assure you, but that certainly was one of them. Now, the question really comes down to, did Stevenson remain at his post at the UN for reasons of expediency, or was it something else? I think he made a misjudgment that he could seriously influence President Johnson on Vietnam. Moreover, it can be argued that Stevenson deluded himself very much on this point. Stevenson, for instance, working with Utah in the autumn of 1964, tried to start a peace initiative with Hanoi. It's going to be a quiet meeting in Burma. This was postponed because of the campaign that fall. And then Utah and Stevenson again start a peace initiative in the early winter of 1965. These both were rejected by Washington. Stevenson regretted and was deeply unhappy that Washington would not pursue these peace initiatives. But when the overtures were not pursued, why didn't he resign? Or why didn't he resign a few weeks before his death, when a group of leading writers and critics, Kay Boyle, Paul Goodman, Dwight MacDonald, some 200, Jules Feiffer, some 200 signed the letter that they brought to Stevenson, about 8 or 9 came to the meeting, when they called on him and asked him to resign and then publicly to oppose the escalation of the war in Vietnam. Now, again, I suspect Stevenson may have deluded himself as to his influence. At the time of his death, he was working on a letter to Paul Goodman, trying to explain through Paul Goodman to the group why he didn't resign as they had asked him to do. And he left behind a letter, so he was working on a draft. And you have corrections and handwriting on the draft that now is in existence. And it may not be the final draft, but it's revealing of his position. He states in this letter that the ultimate disaster of atomic conflict could be avoided only by the pursuit of two clear lines of policy. And to use his own words, the first is to establish a tacitly agreed frontier between the communist and non-communist areas of influence, on the understanding that neither power system will use force to change that status quo. Then he explained in the letter that the years from 1947 to 1962 were largely occupied in fixing such a tacitly agreed line with the Soviet Union, but that there was no such line in Asia. Then later in the letter he says, my hope in Vietnam is that a relatively small-scale resistance now may establish the fact that changes in Asia are not to be precipitated by outside force. That I believe Asia will be more stable if the outcome is the same in both. A negotiated line, and he meant Korea by the other one, a negotiated line and a negotiated peace. This brings me to my second point, the hope of transcending the static policy of containment and moving on to the more creative task of building a world security based on law and on peaceful settlement. And he said, I believe that we must seek a negotiated peace in Vietnam based upon the internationalization of the whole area's security, on a big effort to develop, under the United Nations, the resources of the Mekong River, and guarantees that Vietnam, North and South, can choose, again under international supervision, the kind of governments, the form of association, and if they so decree, the type of reunification of the two states they genuinely want to establish. Then he moves on to what I think is his fundamental point in all this. If we can achieve this, we begin to offer the small nations of the world an alternative to being within spheres of influence. We would begin to establish procedures by which local revolutionary movements, such as the Rising in the Dominican Republic, and for that matter Zanzibar, are not automatically a prey to outside intervention by one or the other of the two great superpowers. And then he concluded the letter by saying, it's my conviction that American policy is groping its way towards this difficult but essential ideal. And this is the reason, both for my support of the policy and for my continuance in a position which gives me some hope of assisting its advance in that direction. In other words, as I interpret it, Governor Stevenson viewed Vietnam as primarily a political problem to be solved primarily by political means. The heavy commitment of American troops occurred after his death, and the policy he felt the United States was groping its way towards was certainly ignored in the next 3-4 years. And in the ensuing debacle in Vietnam of attempting to solve by military means what was primarily a political problem. Now, in other words, what Stevenson was attempting, as I analyze it, however ineffectually, was to alter the course of American diplomacy and to move the United States and the world from, in his words, a position of precarious stability toward agreed international procedures for settling differences, toward the building of an international juridical and policing system, and toward a whole variety of policies designed to turn our small, vulnerable planet into a genuine economic and social community. Well, 2 days before he dropped dead in a street in London, he had a lengthy and revealing talk one evening with his old and trusted friend Eric Sevareid of CBS. Months later after his death, Sevareid wrote this talk up in an article for Look magazine. Severide says what he said that night revealed a profound frustration, a certain resentment that stopped just short of bitterness. And after describing the conversation, the various issues that came up that night, Severide wrote, Governor Stevenson died of exhaustion. He just wore himself out. I don't know how else to put it. Of course, the gathering frustration was part of this, but he did not die of a broken heart. If others regard him as a tragic figure, I don't think he thought of himself that way. Let others call his life a failure. I think, says Severide, it was a wonderful success. When he was 50 years old, 1952, almost nobody but his private friends knew his rare quality. When he died, years later, 1 million people cried. And he had this effect on the world of civilized people without using any of the instruments of power. He did it with words alone and with that wry grin on his battered, lopsided face. All I know as a political reporter, Severide concluded, is that Adlai Stevenson injected humor and happiness and sophistication into American political life. And you have to spend half your life listening to the normal run of American politicians as I do to really understand what a fantastic accomplishment that was. Thank you.
Walter, I know I speak for a great many persons in the audience tonight when I thank you for taking us on this visit to an old friend, much admired. I suspect I speak for 2 or 3 persons here who appreciate this introduction to the Stevenson of 52 and 56, whom they don't remember, not being quite as old as the rest of us. Undoubtedly, there's a wealth of questioning that might arise from this group. Would you be willing to respond if there are questions? I'll get out of the road if any of you wish to ask a question.
Yes, sir.
Some of us thought that President Kennedy would choose Stevenson as the Secretary of State. Hopefully, can you tell us why he didn't?
The question is, some of us thought that President Kennedy would select Adlai Stevenson for Secretary of State, and what is my opinion as to why President Kennedy did not? All right, first, I'll answer it by saying that after President Kennedy, or Senator Kennedy, won the nomination out here in 1960, Adlai Stevenson went out to campaign to rally the Stevensonians behind him, because you know the Stevensonians, particularly the California ones, are pretty, shall we say, sore? That's a mild word, isn't it? And he intended only to make about 4 speeches for the Senate. He made about 80. And probably, helped that narrow margin in a number of states for Kennedy's victory. And he wanted to be Secretary of State. No question of it. Fact is, Senator Kennedy offered him a deal. Stevenson never dealt. See, he wasn't the ordinary self-seeking politician. He was quite an unusual person. Senator Kennedy, through an intermediary, said that if Adlai Stevenson would place him, Kennedy, in nomination out here, that he would guarantee him the office of Secretary of State. This was never the way you would win the support of Adlai Stevenson. He man right on the line on what was right, what was principle, and he had pledged that he would not support any of the candidates, you see, that was up to the convention. He was not going to support one against the other. Well, when the election is over, there's considerable pressure on Senator Kennedy from the Stevensonians, and after all, he had a considerable segment of the Democratic Party that were his supporters, to make him Secretary of State. And Kennedy, frankly, did not want a rival power with his own political base as Secretary of State. It's a threat to the president's own power position. That's number one. Number two, Kennedy intended to run foreign policy himself. Other presidents have done this. And he wanted a Secretary of State who was a technician to implement his policies and to be able to get out of the State Department bureaucracy recommendations and move on to the White House. But he did not want a person who was in the position, shall we say, to set the policy himself. The president wanted to run foreign policy. So for these two basic reasons, I think are the answers. But you have to keep in mind that the Kennedy group, the Kennedy clan, I would say in 1960, not the president as much as his brother and others, were absolutely furious at Stevenson, you see, for not having placed Jack in nomination out here. And, you know, the phrase, the Irish Mafia, they're a tough bunch when it comes to this sort of thing. I don't think the president resented nearly as much as the others around the president, so that they pretty well, they supported the senator in his decision not to appoint Adlai Stevenson Secretary of State. Then you go on to a different point for carrying on from this. Some of you may recall that in November of 1962, there was in Washington what was called the Thanksgiving Day Massacre, when Undersecretary of State Chester Bowles was canned as Undersecretary of State. The next step was to get Stevens. And Charles Bartlett, who had been Senator Kennedy's best man at his wedding to Jackie, and Stuart Elsop wrote a feature story for the Saturday Evening Post trying to demonstrate that Adlai had been soft toward the communists on the missile crisis. And this deeply hurt Stevenson because he suspected it must have come from the president. And the Stevensonians rallied. They lost Bowles, but quite clear to the president that they couldn't get rid of Stevenson. Now, why was he trying to get rid of him, or Bowles? Well, you see, Bowles and Stevenson were types who, when you got a problem, like, well, Vietnam you can take, or you can take the Congo and so on, lots of problems are coming up in these years. They wanted to explore each aspect of it and see what the alternative positions were that one might take. These were called the soft guys because they wanted to think about the problems. And that didn't mean they didn't have their own position, but they wanted to explore the others as devil advocate, you see? So that the president would know the range instead of being forced onto a one-page memo of recommendations that wouldn't show the nuances. And the McGeorge Bundys, the Rusks, they wanted the one-position paper for the president and not all this nonsense of an hour's discussion where you analyze what will happen if you do this, that, and the other thing before you come to a final decision. So there was more than mutual exasperate twinge, as I say, on other things than just that Adlai was popular with girls. Was also in foreign policy he saw these as complex problems, and the White House bureaucracy wanted to narrow them down. So Bowles and Stevenson were considered soft in the White House of those days. If we had more softness, we wouldn't have the Bay of Pigs or a lot of other things. Yeah. I can't hear. Sorry. Do which, Stevenson or Kennedy, reflect the democratic ethic the best? Well, I would suggest first that Senator Kennedy, then President Kennedy, is the spiritual heir in domestic politics of Adlai Stevenson. If you study Stevenson's 52 and 56 campaign speeches, 56 they're called Toward the New America, you have in there the emphasis on rethinking relations with the communist bloc that's not monolithic, rethinking the whole role of the federal government in the budget, in economic growth, civil rights, so on. And if you follow through, you will see that many of the ideas built in the 50s are in Jack Kennedy's speeches in the 60 campaign. Some of the same, shall we say, research men transferring over from Stevenson to Kennedy. So I would argue very definitely that President Kennedy's rhetoric was fascinating. His style was quite exciting. But I would say basically he's the spiritual heir of Stevenson. And so my answer would be Stevenson by much more. Yes, ma'am. Sorry.
The relationship between Stevenson and particularly
Yeah, right. One of the difficulties in doing papers of someone in recent political life is that there's always the ubiquitous telephone. And so there are only about 4 letters in the entire collection to Jack Harvey when Stevenson's governor of Illinois, because they lifted the telephone, talked back and forth, obviously. All right, but let's come to the basic question. Look, Stevenson and Douglas, Paul Douglas, were only nominated by the Democratic Party, and in Illinois, as you know, unlike this state, it means once you're nominated, you get the full patronage workers for you, and there's no factionalism, right? Once you got that nomination, the only question is the general election. Any damn fool who runs against you in the primary is hopeless. Now, look, the Democrats were in pretty bad shape in this country in the spring or the winter of 1948, the late winter of 47, early 48. And most of them, well, Jack Harvey came out for Eisenhower, you remember, to replace Truman on the Democratic ticket. They're in bad shape. Now, if you were Jack Harvey, Daley was unimportant then, and you wanted to carry your county ticket, most of those guys only are interested in their county ticket. The sheriff's got 800 jobs in Cook County, patronage jobs. And you get control of the county commission, particularly the chairmanship. They got about 4,000 patronage jobs, just that one office. You say, you want to control that. You want the best ticket you can get for U.S. senator and governor, even you think it's hopeless because Truman's going to be the head of the ticket. It's going to really ruin a lot of things. Can't carry the state. So why not give it to these fancy pants boys, this professor and this diplomat who's been founding the United Nations and happened to have a grandfather who was vice president of the United States. And, he came from downstate Illinois, Bloomington. And so, then you could say to the people who've been grumbling, you put up lousy candidates, say, look, we put up these 2 good guys and the voters didn't take them, so they could get away with some lousy ones for another 8 elections, you see. Now, Jack Harvey, to be honest, at this point, denies this, of course. Yes, he denies it, because Stevenson became a brilliant governor of Illinois, and Jack came to admire him immensely. But at that point, it was a straight power decision. They wanted to carry Cook County. These 2 guys would help them, and they never expected those 2 guys to win, or they'd put regular Democrats on those 2 spots. Then, to their surprise, of course, Stevenson carried the state by 572,000 margin. Last 3 weeks of the campaign, the betting money in Chicago was that Stevenson was going to lose. And Stevenson's campaign manager went to Jack Harvey in the last 3 weeks and tried to borrow $50,000 to pay for radio spots, and he got no loan. Douglas won by 400,000. However, somewhere in this chemistry, I don't know how it happens, Harvey tells the story. Shortly after being governor, shortly after starting as governor, Stevenson started to carry out a number of his pledges, which one was to put the state police under the merit system. In Illinois, every 4 years, if you had a change of parties, all your state policemen were fired, and you appointed the other party, see? And most of these state policemen came from small towns all over Illinois, very important patronage was to get workers in there with the families of this fellow who was a state policeman. And Stevenson decided this was bad public policy, and he decided to place the state police under civil service. Colonel Harvey and others from the Democratic organization of Cook County, which is the only one that matters if you really, in terms of the state Democratic thing, came down to see him, and they pounded on his desk and said, if you do this, we won't support you for governor 4 years hence. He said, gentlemen, if you don't, that's your choice. This is what is good government, and I'm going to do it. He went ahead and did it. And 4 years later, he was so popular as a governor, they didn't dare not support him. So in time, Harvey came to respect him, you see. Now, Daley, as I say, was not power in those days. He was building up toward power, but Harvey was more of a power. Is that enough of an answer to this?
Interested also in the relationship between Stevenson and Daley later on
In 56, it was not superficially cordial, but not really cordial. In the 1960 convention, Daley told Stevenson that the Illinois delegation, meaning his delegation that he controlled it, didn't really want to be formed in '56. And they certainly didn't work very hard for him in '56. With all their vaunted power and all their precinct workers on the public payrolls, they couldn't even carry Chicago, which meant they didn't work very hard. They worked for their county ticket, their local offices, and they forgot the head of the ticket. Now, it was not a cordial relationship at all. And you know, notice now that Adlai III refused the terms that Daley offered for him to run for statewide office, or for the Senate, I guess, and which was, 100% of Lyndon Johnson. And then recently, 2 months ago in Chicago, there was 3 aldermanic positions were open because of death. So there were special elections, and Adlai III backed 3 rebel Democrats against Daley's organization. 2 of the rebels won. Daley's power is cracking, finally. And lastly, as Norman Mailer calls it, the siege of Chicago has having an impact even in Chicago. Sorry.
I was going to ask you about Adlai III, and you partly answered the question, but does he have the qualities of a strong republic?
He's developing quite a distinguished style of his own in terms of public address, writing. He has a different type of wit. Stevenson's was pretty sophisticated wit. I would say that Adlai III is more the Abraham Lincoln type of wit, gut wit, which is probably a little more appealing to voters, if that's what you're after. Because his father, although he wanted to appeal to voters, never felt you should speak down to an audience, nor did he felt that you shouldn't insult an audience without really working hard on your ideas, not just going in, and stringing them along. Well, to illustrate, in 1964, when all representatives of the state house had to run at large because they hadn't redistricted it under the court orders, you were listed from 1 to 80 on the Republican side, and 1 to 80 or whatever, 152 on the Republican, 152 on the Democratic side. And I heard young Adlai deliver a talk, and as he was delivering it, he said, "All my life I've been known as Adlai III. Now I am Adlai 82, which was his number on the ballot." This went over very well. And so I said to him, "I hope you're using it all over the state. That's a good one. Don't throw that line away." Now, I think he has real possibilities as a leader, unless the Daley machine, crushes him, because his father never would have made it in Illinois unless they needed him. So if Daley's machine holds together, Adlai's third's real chance only comes when they need him, to help carry the local ticket for whatever national one. But he may be able to build a rump organization, obviously he's working on it, that can take control of the Democratic Party in Chicago. It's a possibility. Yes?
The governor indicated his frustrations that he found while serving in the United Nations in his writings.
Does he indicate in any of his writings his frustrations over serving in the United Nations? Yeah, I can answer it in part. I can't answer it completely because I'm going on to where the papers are, the letters for that period on. I've only gone through part of his letters on the United Nations. Yes, there are, in some of his personal letters, there definitely is a statement of his frustrations, his weariness, frustrations over his lack of influence in Washington, his really anger at times over the fact that while he's speaking at the United Nations in a debate, there'd be a telephone call from Washington, from the State Department, and someone would say, the governor, the ambassador's got to say the following, and while he's in the middle of a debate, some State Department employee would be coming and slipping notes in front of him on what he should say. This became, and he didn't use the notes, but it became very exasperating that they were doing this type of thing, you say. So, but there is no, as far as I've gone on these letters, there is no indication in them about a statement as when he's going to resign. He told many friends he was going to, but when is no one knows. Probably at the end of the General Assembly in the fall of '65, had he lived. And I think one reason he stayed on so long, even though it was tiring him terribly, was that he felt he had a responsibility to the United Nations as well as the United States. He was at San Francisco at the conference, and then he went on to London as the head of the American delegation in the fall of '45 to build the structure of the UN before the first meetings ever occurred. And he felt that he had a duty to be the ambassador of the United Nations to the people of the United States. That the people of the United States did not appreciate the possibilities of the UN and also the achievements. They just focused on the disagreements and the conflicts at the UN. That's what took him to Dallas 10 days before the president was assassinated, when he himself, as you know, received pretty rough treatment in that charming Texas city. And he went back and urged the president not to go to Dallas. So I can't answer it completely, and furthermore, the State Department security people have put some of his letters under security wraps, and I can't get them.
What was his vote for the United Nations as a world government?
Well, he never spelled it out in terms of world government as such, but he talked in terms of a policing system, an international policing system controlled by the United Nations, and a strengthening of international juridical systems so as the small nations would have protection against the superpowers, not only Russia and the United States, but maybe China later and so on. It's not spelled out in detail anywhere. He may have had it in his mind. This I don't know. But he repeats this phrase that's in the Goodman letter. He went up to Canada to speak at Canadian University about a month before he went to Europe and died. And he there talks about what the UN has done, what it can do better with a few changes in the Charter and a change in the political alliance structure, but never an elaborate constitution, if that's what you mean. No. Yes? What influence did Eleanor Roosevelt have on the political career of Adlai Stevenson? He had great affection for Mrs. Roosevelt, admired her probably more than anybody in American public life, and she had the same affection and admiration for Stevenson. They first met, really. They had occasional contact in Washington during the war, World War II, but they met first in any thorough way when Mrs. Roosevelt was a delegate to the first UN Assembly and then to the second one in '46, '47, and Stevenson was an alternate delegate, but since he'd helped write all the structure in London, he did a great deal of the policy work, and he and Mrs. Roosevelt built up an immense affection for each other. Their handwritten letters to each other, copies of which I have, are just beautiful. And you recall it was Mrs. Roosevelt in 1956 who said to President Truman, when Truman was trying to block Stevenson from the nomination and was trying to build up support for Averell Harriman, that Truman's argument was that this man doesn't have enough experience, Stevenson, to be president. And she called him up to her apartment in the Blackstone during the convention, and she laid him out. And she just said, "Mr. President, you didn't have as much experience as Adlai Stevenson when you took over from my husband." And then she went on in the later press conference, she really showed her admiration for Stevenson. And as to 1960, of course, she wanted Stevenson as the Democratic nominee. In a famous press conference, which was resented by Senator Kennedy, she said, "The senator writes books about political courage, profiles in courage, but he didn't show any about Joe McCarthy. That hurt." I shall publish all of Adlai Stevenson's letters to Mrs. Roosevelt, I assure you. Yes. Oh, did Stevenson have influence in the United Nations as an institution, right? That's what you're asking, yeah. Okay. Yeah, there's no question of it. I've just been on a trip of 3 months into the Pacific and then into Asia to interview people who were on their own delegations to the United Nations while Stevenson was ambassador. And the point that kept coming across constantly from all of them was that Adlai Stevenson gave the United Nations real style and real class, and by that, as I would explore them, what they fundamentally meant was it helped the work of the UN to have a U.S. ambassador who would go to the American people and explain what the UN did, and that also helped them back in their own countries. So yes, quite clearly in this area of work, not in the day-to-day committee meetings. That was done by younger people in all the delegations, but many of them said he was our star. He's the greatest figure the UN's ever had from any delegation, you see, from any country. There's no doubt of it. There's no doubt in the world of this. Yes?
He set forth solutions for the peaceful resolution of the problems in the Middle East. He was writing that.
Did he set forth the solutions to the settlement of Lend-Lease after the war? Oh. Oh my, yeah, the Middle East. In 1947, as a delegate, this time he was a delegate, he voted for the resolution before the United Nations on the, the two states that would be created. He, I don't know how to answer it from there on. He certainly studied the question, visited Arab side, Israeli side, talked to many leaders. I was with him in all those conversations. It was very strange because he was committed to Israel as an independent nation, no question about that. But some of the Israeli leaders seemed to be irritated that we asked questions. We asked about what the problem would be if certain number of bonds weren't bought a year in terms of economic development. We asked questions about how were the Arab refugees being handled and how were they the Arabs that remained, in Israel. And they seemed to be irritated by these questions, whereas we asked them in every other country, and they may have been irritated, but they didn't show their irritation, at least, because we were trying to learn, that's all. And I'll never forget, when we got back to Chicago, Stevenson made a speech to the citizens group, sort of a report to the nation thing. 2 hours before he went on the radio and TV, I got a call from a mutual friend, from a friend in New York, important leader in the Zionist movement, saying that I had to get one word out of Adlai Stevenson's speech. I said, "What's the word?" And they said over the phone, and I said, "Look, you don't listen well. You're so sensitive about Israel, you don't read the English language at this point. The word is doughty," I said, D-O-U-G-H-T-Y. They thought it was dowdy, D-O-W-D-Y, you say. And I said, "Look, tell your friend in New York, I've tried to get that word out of that speech for 2 days, that it's bad radio and TV, because you might slough it. It's a very difficult word, to use. It's fine in literature, but tough word in public speaking." And so it became very, but there's no question of his support on the basic support on Israel, but what he felt was there had to be some kind of basic mediation, which they're now apparently trying to do in this 4-power talk or whatever's going on in Paris, or in New York, I guess, in terms of the Arab refugees. This is long ago, now it's only a more serious problem, on the question of internationalization of Jerusalem, and on the question of correction of boundaries, where boundaries were silly, where a farm was split off from the house. This is the type of thing he was recommending, I know, for years. Now, in the UN, I don't know, because that's part of the period, you see, that I haven't been able to read his letters about Chet. Mm-hmm. Any more? Yes, ma'am. I didn't hear, did you? Is the question, how would world history be different or developments if Stevenson had been elected president? Is that the question? Of course, I don't know anything, but I'll do if you want just an opinion, isn't it? It's all it is. Well, number one, I think you would have had, what? Yeah.
I want to amplify. I have a question.
All right, add an amendment.
Difference has been raised that Stevenson did not have the strength, type of strength
Oh, good. I want to answer that one, yeah. Yeah, okay, all right. May I answer that first and come into the second? Don't let me lose the first one by answering this. Yeah. The statement that he's indecisive, right? And couldn't make up his mind. You know, this is a fascinating, intriguing problem. My good colleague here in history will agree with me that one of the real problems is how do you get through the myth-making that goes on? Historians fall for it just like everybody else, you say. And as governor of Illinois, Stevenson made some tough decisions. And he really raised the tone of state government in this country. This attracted nationwide attention. And he made tough decisions, including firing his campaign manager when he found, then by this time his executive assistant, when he found out that his executive assistant actually, unknowingly, this was not something deliberate, bought some stock in a racetrack. The legislature had already passed the bill, been signed by the governor, and after it had all been passed and such, he bought stock, 10 cents a share, and within a week it went to $1 a share. So Stevenson fired. One of the toughest things he had to do. Stevenson had to tell Harvey and the Democrats that that he didn't care. He was going ahead with civil service for the state police. He was, one of the things he wanted was a constitutional convention to revise the Illinois Constitution, which is still basically the Constitution written in the Granger period of the 1870s. It reflects rural downstate Illinois control of the state when the population is in the Cook County area or East St. Louis, you say. Absolutely archaic Constitution. And he could have had it. He could have had the votes in the state Senate, where he lacked the votes to get a call for the convention, if he would veto 3 bills to control gangsters in Chicago. There are 3 senators from the River Ward area of Chicago came into him and said, okay, Gov, you can have it. You can have your convention, but you veto the crime bills. He vetoed the crime bills. How does the myth grow then? Grows for 3 basic reasons. 1, in January of 1952, Harry Truman offered Adlai Stevenson the Democratic nomination for the presidency on a platter. And Stevenson said no. Stevenson said, I have 4 more years as governor if I'm elected. I wish to carry out what I've started there to make it a museum piece of government, state government. And Harry Truman's been sore ever since. Harry Truman doesn't understand why someone in public life didn't want to be president. He didn't understand Stevenson. And so Truman, right after the 52 defeat, starts saying, well, that man's indecisive. He shouldn't have been nominated anyway. And you'll find it in Truman's autobiography, or everything he writes. You see, historians are going to have a hell of a time unraveling what happened in the Truman period from what Harry says happened. And by the way, Lyndon's going to do just as much, or even more. He's got a whole big stable of historians down there in Texas with $1 million contract from one publisher. So John, you want to take it on? And all through the 56 thing, when Truman's trying to block Stevenson from the nomination, it's constant time. Stevenson's indecisive, you see. So this gets into the literature, and the newspaper men quote it all over the place. Then after 56, it's the Kennedy clan that starts it, because they figure that Stevenson is the main threat to the senator getting the nomination in 1960. Then since then, this business I analyzed about the soft and hard guys in foreign policy during these years, all it means is that when a problem was placed in front of Stevenson's desk, he wouldn't make an immediate decision. He would say, well, I want to know all the angles on this one. What does so-and-so say? I want a report in 2 hours from so-and-so. I want to hear so-and-so and so-and-so. Then he would hear them all, read their reports, and decide what, in the basis of his principles, what was the thing to do. Well, that meant he was trying to think out these problems. He wasn't these hard-nosed guys, you know. They make the decisions. They make the decisions. And as Ken Galbraith said in an article in Stevenson recently, we should have had some of those soft guys when it came to the question of escalation in Vietnam and a few other questions, the country might not be in such bad shape. So it goes back to this fundamental trait of his of intellectual curiosity, wanting to know all aspects before a major decision. Didn't mean he couldn't make it. He made plenty as governor. But he wanted to know before he made them. But the myth-making by the other two Democrats is fascinating. Now, I didn't answer. Now, now where do we move on to? Well, okay. Okay. So I've tried to say that I tried to dispose of this thing. He's indecisive, okay? I would think one of the most important things he would have done from 53 on was to try to defuse what I referred to in my talk as witless, mindless anti-communism. Try to get away from the emotion around this issue and to try to approach the problem, you know, in sense of knowing Russian culture, history, the drives and there and what our drives were, and to try to keep down emotion that all communists are alike, and to realize it's not monolithic. As UN ambassador, I know, and this probably have been, he tried this as president, he tried to persuade President Kennedy to withdraw U.S. objection to China in the United Nations. He thought he had the president persuaded when the bear pigs came along. And Kennedy said to him, "Can't do it now. If I do it now, they really say I'm soft on the communists," you see. The Democrats have faced this thing that's been hung around their neck for, what, 18 years now? Soft on the communists all the time. They're frightened to death of it. And then Stevenson's persuading him. It takes months to get over the bear pig shock, as you know, for President Kennedy. And he thinks he's got him about persuaded in 1962 for the General Assembly meeting when the Cuban Missile Crisis comes. Obviously, that's no time to talk about withdrawing U.S. objections to China in the United Nations. And so again, you have to wait for months before you can come back on the issue. And again, he's talking to him about it. And again, the assembly meeting is now taking place when President Kennedy goes off to Dallas. So I would have thought in that area. I would have thought in, in domestic affairs, for instance, as examples, he long before 1961 realized the important role of the federal government in terms of its budgetary and fiscal policies in economic growth. He was greatly influenced here by Seymour Harris, distinguished economist, and John Kenneth Galbraith on this. And really, the new frontier in terms of domestic matters is the Galbraithian Seymour Harris thing. Well, this is in the Stevenson mind in the mid-50s, so I would have thought you'd have moved that way on domestic economic policy under Stevenson. On civil rights, he tried to desegregate the schools in Illinois without much power to do it in those days. You didn't have a Supreme Court decision, and you have Southern Illinois, Cairo and such, you know, which is further south than North Carolina. He certainly moved in to Oak Park when Dr. Julian moved out there, and the neighbors began to try to prevent a Negro from living there. And Stevenson saw the local police weren't protecting Dr. Julian, so he simply put state police in there and protected him. But events have moved so fast since the 50s in this field as so many others. It's always dangerous, you know, to speculate. But that I think he would have put the moral position of the White House, however, behind the Supreme Court decision of 1954, which is something President Eisenhower never did, as you know. And had the moral prestige of the White House been put behind that desegregation decision, much more would have been implemented since that time, or particularly in that crucial period of the first year after the decision. I think there's no question in my mind he would have done that at a press conference or at a major speech. Well, in Vietnam, he viewed it basically, as I said, as a political problem, not as a military problem. And his feelings are clear not only in this last letter that he was working on, but much earlier through his period. basically felt that the area, once, we're not talking about the early 50s now, or the mid, we're talking about later, that the area had to be, the only safety for the area would be internationalization. This is quite close to what Chester Bowles proposed, too, as Undersecretary of State. International supervision, international guarantee of the security of the area, so that it wouldn't be unilateral, whether it's on the part of the United States or on the part of China or the Soviet Union. And once you had unilateral guarantee of the integrity of the area, then international supervision of elections, and come what may, that is, it brought the North and South into one government. That was up to the people through free elections supervised internationally, and he meant it. He didn't mean phony elections like the one we had with Chu and Key a couple of years ago. He meant internationally supervised elections where you had a really free election. And if they agreed to join together, they joined together, as, of course, the Geneva Accord says anyway, in 1954. I haven't read enough of his letters yet to know whether he does talk much about the Geneva Accords before he dies in '65. Mm-hmm. Well, some of his critics, you see, Walton's book is a very interesting one, and it has some very, very good insights. Walton's argument, in part, and some of his other critics, is that he should have resigned in '65 and gone to the country the way Gene McCarthy did it in late '67, early '68. Mm-hmm.
I would suggest one more question.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Did Stevenson have any weaknesses that you could tell us about?
Yeah, sure. One of his weaknesses actually was a positive virtue, and that is Stevenson, positive virtue in terms of human being, but not in terms of getting elected, and might have been some of a handicap in the White House, and that is he despised this word image and image making and public relations in general. So what he was constantly striving for the clear sentence, the pungent sentence, to get ideas across, and he was not nearly concerned enough in terms of, I think, of effectiveness at times, on how he projected over radio and TV. He drove his advisors crazy on this, because the speech would be carefully timed, 28 minutes, whatever it was. As he's waiting to be introduced, he'd be rewriting and adding. Then he'd get on, and the peroration would be cut off of TV. This happened in the '52 campaign. We had to find $75,000 in order to buy a half-hour time 1 hour later. It took some doing to get him on so he could read his peroration. Well, the Eisenhower administration was much more adept, that's what you say, at public relations. This was a weakness in terms, I said humanly, it's fine to find someone who says, look, I'm going to be myself. And this is what he always said. He was going to be himself, and he was going to stand for the principles he stood for, and people came to him and said, oh, but that's politically not expedient. This is not the decision he made, but this is a grave weakness in trying to get elected in American life. So, that's one weakness. Another weakness, I suppose this doesn't sound like it should be said this way, but he was a terribly lonely man, a very lonely man, and as a result of being a lonely man, times he would he was a basic optimist about politics and about the future of things. Times he'd become pretty depressed about society in general, really. Lonely because his divorce really was a shattering had a shattering impact on him from 1949 on. His sister once saw him working about midnight in the White House, in the state mansion, and she urged him to go to bed, and he said, look, I failed as a husband. I'm not going to fail as a governor. And move on from that, which means he did really too much work himself personally as governor. He may have tried that in the White House. That could be a handicap, obviously, or a weakness. I would think so, because you have so many problems you can't handle them all in depth yourself. So I think that probably was a weakness. Thank you very much.
I have a feeling that by imposing a limitation of only one more question, I took away a $75,000 peroration that you may have wanted to give. But you may want to collect that individually from Professor Johnson. Thank you ever so much, Walter. You're welcome. Very good.